I want you to be able to give that little boy the answer to the question, what the hell is that, when he points at a fancy A next. So the fancy A and the fancy G are letters that are left over through language evolution. So what you could tell them, without making anything up at all, is that those are language fossils. They are parts of our language that show up some places and not other places because they come from a time when our language was pretty different. A long, long time ago, every single thing that was ever written down or read had to be done by hand. We didn't have computers, and we didn't have typewriters, and we didn't have printers and Xerox machines, and we didn't even have this thing called the printing press, which was like the first printer ever. Before that, everything had to be written by hand. So we got this printing press, but the problem was the writing that we had, it looked so different, and all the letters ran together, and a lot of them looked a lot the same. So you had to study a long time and practice really, really hard to be able to tell the different letters apart, so not very many people would read or write. It was like a secret code for the really rich and powerful people. But over time, there were more people, and when you have more people, you need more people to be in charge of them. And when we needed more people to be in charge of them, we needed more people that could read and could write. So the way we wrote letters down, it had to get simpler, because if it was simpler, it wouldn't take as much time or energy or be as hard for people to learn, and we needed more people to learn. And eventually there were so many people, we had to have even more people know how to read and how to write so they could be in charge of everybody. And when that happened, somebody thought it would be a really good idea to be able to send messages a really long way, and no matter how bad somebody's handwriting was, they'd still be able to read it. And they made this machine called the printing press. It was like the first printer. But this printer had like blocks inside of it. And the blocks inside of it had little letters on it. And you could rearrange them in different orders. And when you rearranged them in different orders, you could make different words. And this was so cool. And every guy that had a printing press had his own typeface. That's what they called the block letters. And then they all wanted to be fancy. So they made their letters all look a little bit different. And eventually, the really powerful rich people are like, I like those letters and I don't like those letters, so use those letters more. And then everybody would copy the guy who was popular and use blocks that look like his. And eventually, all the blocks kind of really start to look a lot the same. And all the letters, they start looking really different because we don't have time to teach all these people how to read. We have to make it easier. But then we didn't need people to just be able to read the notes that we sent them. We needed them to be able to send us letters back and write down their own thoughts and stuff. So we tried to teach people how to do script, and they couldn't because it was too different from how they were taught to read. So instead, we took those little block letters from the guys that had the printing presses, and we put them on paper, and we, instead of asking people to write with script, which was kind of like swirly lines that all lined up together, we asked them to just do what the printing press did and imitate it. That's why when you're taught to write, it's called printing. You're printing your letters because you're copying what a printing press would do. And the first alphabet we used to teach kids had the fancy A and the fancy G in it. But when people were writing the fancy A and the fancy G as time went on, they didn't actually write them that way. They look like the A and the G that we teach you now. So because that showed up in what we were writing and lots of people were reading things that were wrote down, it showed up in the printing press, in the font, in the typeface. And so once it was in the typeface, somebody said, this is the best typeface to teach kids how to print. And so we used that one to teach you how to write your letters. But all of the books and all of the papers that were getting printed, a lot of them still had a fancy A and a fancy G. And we wanted to make sure that you'd know how to read those. So we leave them in some of the stuff. They're fossils, they're dinosaurs, they're leftovers. But you need them if you want to read anything older than when we started teaching the A and the G the way that we do now. Because languages are just like every other thing. They're alive. And because they are alive, they grow and they change the longer they're used. That's how I would explain it to my kiddos if I had an opportunity to come to your class and explain it. But the fancy G and the fancy A get a lot of hate, but I think they are pretty cool language fossils. And it lets you talk to kids about how crazy it is that languages live, breathe, and evolve. Because there's not a lot cooler than knowing that the way you use your language is right. And history's proved that to us. Because the people who did it the old way, eventually the old way just becomes wrong, and the way people are doing it now becomes the right way.